welcome Tooba Aisha Rizvi, who is going to continue us on our journey today with the order of knowledge. So
good morning, afternoon, evening, everybody, whatever time zones you are in. I'd like to begin with a quick disclaimer. I'm barely scratching the surface of a universe that is quite literally the size of a small library. The Harry Potter series is not just a text; we all know that it's an ecosystem with one with its own laws and archives and bureaucracies and epistemic crises. What I'm presenting is therefore a modest attempt to map a very large world. I'm barely, as I told you, scratching the surface here, and to keep my broom from flying off course, I'm focusing only on the Harry Potter series. No Fantastic Beasts, no post-Potter politics. Let us keep our chaos Hogwarts-sized right now. So let's begin. The wand may choose the wizard, but the question that truly unsettles the wizarding world is that who chooses the knower? What counts as credible knowledge? Whose testimony is trusted? And which memories are made official? These are not just questions of magic, they are questions of epistemic design. Beneath the duels and the spells lies an invincible and invisible structure, what might be called the order of knowledge, that decides what can be known and by whom it can be known. So the wizarding world runs on supervised truths that are archived, edited, and occasionally erased. Ministries legislate memory, newspapers dictate belief, and schools prescribe what passes as legitimate knowledge. Even magic obeys an epistemic hierarchy. Some forms of knowing are celebrated as wisdom, and others are simply dismissed as madness or forbidden as dark. Yet the question of knowledge here is not simply what one knows, how one comes to be recognized as a knower at all. Knowledge, after all, does not exist in isolation. It passes through acts of recognition and through systems of credibility, um, through the politics of listening and believing. And wherever some voices are amplified and others are dismissed, knowledge ceases to be neutral. It becomes relational and contingent and vulnerable to injustice. So in this sense, it is in this sense that the series stages a world of epistemic hierarchies, a world where truth must be certified, testimony must be authorized, and memory is controlled. As Dumbledore once tells Harry, the truth is a beautiful and terrible thing and should therefore be treated with great caution. Um, it's precisely this caution, the guardedness of truth, the ethics of telling and withholding that animates the epistemic politics of the wizarding world. I read it as a philosophical miniature of larger debates on knowledge, power, and justice. So if the wizarding world is organized around, then the next question becomes, how does this order operate in practice? How is truth curated and whose testimony counts and by what mechanisms are voices silenced and others are amplified? In the series, these questions are not only moral or social, they are structural. Magical technologies like obliviation and pensive stage the mechanics of remembering and forgetting, while institutions such as ministry and Hogwarts and the Daily Prophet govern what knowledge is recognized and what is discredited. So, in other words, the series gives form to epistemic hierarchies, patterns of knowing and not knowing, of authority and exclusion that shape the moral, ethical, and political terrain of the wizarding world. What follows is the tracing of these dynamics, how knowledge becomes a site of power, how authority is claimed and contested, how the series imagines resistance within and beyond the boundaries of wizarding epistemology. To begin with, we'll begin with the Ministry of Magic itself. So the Ministry of Magic is not simply a political institution. It is, and to use a Foucauldian term, it is a regime of truth. Foucault reminds us that every society has its regime of truth, its general politics of truth, the types of discourse it accepts and makes function is as true, the mechanisms which distinguish true and false statements, and the status of those charged with saying what counts as truth. In the wizarding world, this regime, apart from other ways, is also meticulously bureaucratized. Through laws, decrees, and media control, the ministry transforms knowledge into an act of governance. Truth here is not discovered but produced. It is not liberated but licensed. So when Cornelius Fudge dismisses Harry's account of Voldemort's return, he is not simply refusing to believe a child. He is defending an epistemic order. Harry's knowledge threatens the stability of that order because it originates outside the sanctioned channels of truth, outside the ministry, outside official records, outside adulthood and authority. The paper, the code, the bureaucracy do not merely reflect reality, they produce it. Within this regime, epistemic injustice becomes structural rather than incidental. The notion of epistemic injustice is explicated by philosopher Miranda Fricker as a distinctive kind of injustice done to a knower in their role as a knower. So when credibility for a person's ability to produce knowledge is prejudicially or wrongfully withheld, it is termed epistemic injustice. It sits at the intersection of ethics, epistemology, and social justice, and is linked to social power structures intertwined with intersectional advantages and disadvantages connected to our identities. Following Miranda Fricker, we might say that Harry's testimony is disqualified not because of its content, but because of his social identity as a student, a child, and also because of him being an emotional witness. So Harry's insistence that Voldemort has returned is treated as hysteria rather than witness, while the Daily Prophet converts institutional denial into public truth. Miranda Fricker might say this is an epistemic injustice, but Foucault, who's ever the troublemaker, he would remind us that it is a form of governance. It becomes a system where refusing to know becomes a form of political maintenance. Ignorance in this sense is not the opposite of knowledge, but one of its effects. The deliberate organization of who may know and who may not, and who must forget, of course. We'll come back to this idea of ignorance later um, when we discuss the obliviation charm. The hearings before the Wizengamot in Order of Phoenix dramatizes this perfectly. Um, the entire trial functions less as a pursuit of truth than as a performance of truth's management. Dumbledore's authority is carefully sidelined and Harry's voice systematically undermined. The procedural correctness replaces ethical inquiry here. Now, talking of Dumbledore, who's one of the most controversial figures in the Harry Potter universe, every structure of power has its own prophet, the one who claims to see from above what others can only stumble upon below. In Harry Potter, that figure is Dumbledore. Um, Donna Haraway reminds us that all knowledge is inescapably situated against what she calls the God trick, the illusion of a neutral, all-seeing vantage point that knows everything from nowhere. Haraway says that every act of knowing emerges from a specific position, a specific body, and history. In the wizarding world, one figures that embodies the fantasy of God's eye view more than anyone else. The person who embodies this is, of course, Albus Dumbledore, um, the most controversial figure in the Harry Potter universe. Dumbledore's authority rests not only on wisdom, but on his ability to see what others cannot, to hold knowledge in reserve, to orchestrate revelation, and to justify concealment as moral necessity. As he tells Harry, the quote that I just mentioned, the truth is a beautiful and terrible thing, should therefore be treated with great caution. What Dumbledore calls caution, however, is also a form of epistemic monopoly that only he holds. Um, Dumbledore's selective distribution of knowledge, his decision to withhold the prophecy, the Hallows, or full truth about Snape, it reveals a paternalistic epistemology, one that assumes ethical right to manage who is ready to know. His vantage point is precisely what Haraway warns against, the epistemic arrogance of a detached knower who confuses perspective with omniscience. The problem is not that Dumbledore lies, but that his truth telling operates through secrecy and through hierarchy. He turns truth into a rationed resource, treating ignorance as a form of protection and legitimizes this as the language of the greater good. The other case that talks about that also fits in this idea of situated knowledge is Hermione's SPEW campaign, which offers a striking counterpoint to this epistemic privilege. Her attempt to recognize house elves as moral and political subjects is grounded not only in institutional authority but in ethical attempts, what Haraway might call an embodied, accountable way of knowing. Her knowledge arises from empathy and from contact. It is situated in the everyday encounters of care rather than in an abstract law or expertise that Dumbledore did. Yet this form of knowing is repeatedly dismissed from the wizarding community as naive, as emotional, and even sometimes as absurd. Her knowledge of injustice is socially discredited by Harry, Ron, Winky, and even Dumbledore. Though he later acknowledges that how self-injustice does exist, but he doesn't really support her at that point. All these people insist that the elves like their servitude. The other's mockery of SPEW exposes how epistemic hierarchies work to delegitimize moral knowledge that does not conform to dominant rationalities. Knowledge that arises from empathy or ethical consciousness, what Haraway would call situated knowledge, is dismissed in favor of the objective rationality that sustains the status quo. Now, alongside Hermione, there are characters like Luna Lovegood and Professor McGonagall, also up to a certain point, who inhibit situated knowledges. So, Luna's eccentric epistemology, which is grounded in imagination and faith and affective openness, challenges the empiricist realism of the wizarding world. Her capacity to perceive what others ridicule, for example, testers or nagas, even the intangible threads of belief, reveals a kind of epistemic humility, a willingness to let the unknown remain partially unknowable, which is the solution to the entire problem. In contrast to Dumbledore's godlike overview, Luna's vision is plural, it's intimate, and it's porous. She does not master knowledge, she communes with it. Now, together, these women, Hermione, Luna, even McGonagall, constitute a counter archive of epistemic practices within Hogwarts, offering plural, embodied, and ethically attentive ways of knowing against Dumbledore's transcendental authority. Human knowns like Hermione, Luna, and McGonagall expose the limits of Dumbledore's authority. Non-human epistemic communities push that critique even further. There are centaurs, goblins, and house elves who embody knowledge that is systematically othered, dismissed, or mistrusted by wizarding society. In the Philosopher's Stone and in the Order of Phoenix, centaurs like Pyrens, I am really not sure how to pronounce that, uh, possess astronomical divinatory knowledge. Yet Hogwarts treats their insights as peripheral or dangerously ambiguous. Goblins offer another site of epistemic tension. Their knowledge of metalwork, runes, and banking is not only specialized but socially devalued by wizards who assume human mastery as the standard. The Green God's ward system, with its rigid enforcement of human oversight, renders goblin knowledge legible only insofar as it can be incorporated into wizard norms. Here, the anthropocentric hierarchy of credibility is made explicit. Expertise exists, but it is only recognized if it conforms to dominant social assumptions. And dominant social assumptions are always created. Like in Hogwarts, the sorting hat becomes the very first act of epistemic profiling. It shapes whose voice will be credible. Once the sorting happens, every student's access to knowledge and recognition is filtered through the house identity. A Ravenclaw's opinion, for example, must always be well reasoned, and a Hufflepuff's opinion must always be well meaning. Neville's constant anxiety regarding his placement in Gryffindor stems from this very pressure to adhere to the epistemic profiling of the sorting hat. It defines whose achievements are celebrated, whose failures are expected, and whose moral compass is trusted. It decides which epistemic styles are legitimate, and reason, bravery, loyalty, inhibition, absurdly being the only four options one can choose from. If human and non-human knowers are policed by epistemic hierarchies, magic also polices memory itself. Knowledge is not just controlled by authority, it is curated and rationed and sometimes actively erased. Ignorance, as Nancy Tuana reminds us, is not merely absence of knowledge, but a form of power. The state decides what must be known. In the wizarding world, obliviation is the literal embodiment of this logic. Memories are selectively wiped, witnesses are silenced, and histories rendered invisible. So getting here is not accidental, it is sanctioned and systematized and, very importantly, strategic. The pensive, in contrast, offers a curious kind of epistemic control. Memory is extracted, organized, and displayed. Even here, selection is key. The pensive is not a neutral archive, it is an epistemic sieve, privileging certain perspectives while marginalizing others. Much as Boventura de Sousa Santos, again, I'm unable to pronounce this name, she warns of epistemicide. Entire knowledge is rendered unthinkable or illegible. Marianne Hirsch's notion of post memory also resonates here. The memories we inherit, especially after trauma, are mediated partially and affectively and are affectively charged. Memory transmission is never simple, and forgetting is never neutral. Paul Ricoeur adds another layer to this. Memory and history are intertwined, but remembering always requires interpretation, while forgetting is both inevitable and politically fraught. These points lead to a fundamental set of questions as to who counts as the knower and how do we navigate the limits and responsibilities of epistemic authority. Where do we draw the line? And the answer, although the answer is not very clear, but it comes to something like not all knowledge claims are equally credible. Epistemic authority exists for a reason. Some claims require expertise and evidence and rigorous reasoning. If everyone were automatically treated as a reliable knower, truth itself could be destabilized. But at the same time, authority should not be absolute or exclusionary. The problem is when credibility is socially or institutionally monopolized. As with Dumbledore, the Ministry, or Hogwarts's rigid hierarchies, certain knowers are disbelieved or silenced not because their knowledge is wrong, but because it challenges the dominant regime of truth. And criteria for recognition, epistemic justice calls for context-sensitive evaluation where credibility should be assessed based on competence and experience and perspective, not arbitrary social markers like bloodline or species or eccentricity or even gender. Recognize plural situated knowledges like Hermione, Luna, Hauser, Professor Trelawney, etc. Expands the epistemic community without granting uncritical credence. Fantasy, therefore, becomes the guide. In Harry Potter, we see both extremes. Authority monopolizes knowledge and marginalizes voices that resist it. Fantasy allows us to explore these tensions deeply, showing that knowledge is relational and context dependent. So if magic can shape who knows, perhaps imagination can shape what knowing actually means. What I'm trying to look into is an epistemic imagination of fantasy. How does fantasy itself, as a genre, perform epistemic resistance? Fantasy destabilizes it imagines otherwise. The genre is very formed as an epistemic duality, but an epistemic counterworld in itself, where myth, magic, and metaphor allow the reenactment of knowledge beyond established hierarchies and sanctioned authorities. That will be it. Thank you so much for being a patient listeners.